Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant issue, the economic cost of biological invasions within the European Union. It's often talked about, but maybe not the full picture.
That's right. We're talking about invasive alien species, things like plants, insects, animals that shouldn't be there. And they're causing real harm to ecosystems, biodiversity, and, well, human well-being too.
And the costs are potentially astronomical. We know they're expensive, but a new study suggests what we think we know is just maybe the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. Like we've been looking at the small change while a massive bill is building up unseen.
So our mission today is a deep dive into a specific paper, unveiling the hidden economic toll of biological invasions in the European Union. It's led by Morgan Henry and Brian Leung, with senior authors Corey Bradshaw and Philip Haubrock.
And their core question was basically, are we drastically undercounting in financial damage here? And if so, by how much?
It's a critical question, isn't it? Because the EU, being this huge hub for global trade, is particularly vulnerable.
Absolutely. And previous attempts to tally the costs, well, they had problems. Big gaps in knowledge, like which species are actually causing trouble and where are the costs even being recorded.
Which makes it really hard to create effective policy, right, if you don't know the scale of the problem.
Precisely. You can't manage what you don't measure, or at least measure accurately.
Okay, so let's start with what was known. The researchers used the InverCost database. That's kind of the go-to source for this stuff. What did it say about the total reported costs over, 60 years?
Yeah, they looked at the period from 1960 to 2020 across all the EU member states. And the number in the database was US $129.9 billion. Let's call it $130 billion.
Wow, okay. $130 billion sounds massive. That's a huge number.
It does. But, and this is a really big but, the researchers knew they needed to be careful. Not all reported costs are created equal, Some are estimates, some projections, some aren't well documented.
Right, so you need to focus on the really solid, verifiable numbers. What happened when they filtered that $130 billion down to just the cost they called highly reliable observed, the ones we can actually trust?
Well, that's where things get pretty stark. When they stripped away all the less certain data and focused only on costs that were actually incurred, documented, and came from peer-reviewed studies or official government reports, that huge $130 billion figure just collapsed. It plummeted down to only US $7.3 billion. That's about $7.7 billion.
Oh, from $130 billion down to $7.3 billion.
Yep. That $7.3 billion is the hard, verifiable cost baseline they could actually stand behind.
Okay, so that $7.3 billion is the floor. But the real issue isn't just unreliable data, it's the missing data, isn't it? They call this the taxonomic gap.
Exactly. This is maybe the most startling part. They identified around 13,331 known invasive alien species that are established in the EU. They're here, they're reproducing.
Okay, over 13,000 species.
But when they checked how many of those species actually had any economic costs recorded in the InverCost database, the number was just 259.
Hold on, 259 out of more than 13,000.
That's right. It works out to about 1%. Maybe slightly more, but basically 1%.
1%.
So for 99% of the known established invaders in the EU, we have absolutely zero documented economic cost information in this global database.
That's not a gap, that's a chasm. It means policymakers are essentially flying blind on 99% of the problem.
It really illustrates the challenge. How can you possibly allocate resources effectively or prioritize management if you only have cost data for such a tiny fraction of the species causing impacts?
So the big question then is, how do they try to fill this enormous gap? If the baseline data only covers 1%, how do you possibly estimate the cost of the other 99%?
Right, they couldn't just guess.
Yeah.
They needed a systematic way to project known costs into unknown situations. First, they got even more conservative with their starting point.
More conservative than the $7.3 billion.
Yeah, for their modeling, they used an even tighter subset. Just 162 specific, highly reliable, observed cost entries at the country level. These came from only 49 different species and totaled US $4.7 billion.
Okay, $4.7 billion. That's the super solid, undeniable minimum they worked from. So what was the method?
They used a really clever approach, something they termed macroeconomic scaling.
Macroeconomic scaling, can you break that down a bit?
Sure. Imagine an invasive insect causes, say, $1 million in damage to forests in Germany. Germany has a large economy, a big forestry sector.
Okay.
Now, what if that same insect is also established in, let's say, Latvia? Latvia has a different economic scale, a different size forestry sector relative to its GDP.
Yeah.
You can't just assume the cost in Latvia is also $1 million.
Right, it wouldn't make sense. You'd have to adjust it somehow.
Exactly. So they built a statistical model. It takes a known, reliable cost for a specific species in one country and projects what the equivalent cost might be in another country where that same species is present, but, crucially, where costs haven't been reported.
And how does it make that projection? What factors does it use?
It uses several key scaling factors to account for those differences between countries. Things like gross domestic product, GDP, how wealthy the country is, population size, the physical area of the country.
Makes sense.
And really importantly, the size or importance of the sector being impacted, like agriculture or forestry, as a percentage of that country's total GDP.
Ah, okay. So it's adjusting for both the overall economy and how significant the affected area is within that economy.
Precisely. It's a sophisticated way to interpolate, to fill in the blanks, based on known economic realities. Sort of like taking a documented bill from one household and adjusting it based on the income and size of all the other houses on the street where the same problem exists.
That's a really innovative way to tackle such a massive data gap. So what happened when they applied this macroeconomic scaling method to the EU data? What did the numbers look like then?
Well, this is where the headline finding comes in. The results were, frankly, staggering. After applying their model to interpolate those missing costs, their corrected estimate of the observed costs jumped by potentially 501%.
500%.
501% higher than the previously recorded reliable figure. So that initial $4.7 billion base they used for modeling, or the $7.3 billion reliable total, balloons dramatically.
So what's the new total estimated observed cost then after this correction?
Their calculation puts the interpolated total observed cost at US $28.0 billion. That's around $30.9 billion.
Yeah.
And remember, this is just for the observed costs of the damage and management that has already happened and could, in theory, be documented.
$28 billion, that's almost 4 times the $7.3 billion we thought was a reliable number.
Exactly. And they wanted to make sure this wasn't just skewed by one or two enormous freak events. You know, sometimes a single pest outbreak can cost billions in one go.
Right, outliers. Did they check for that?
They did. They ran a robustness check where they excluded the 2 highest impact sort of outlier cost entries. Even doing that, the corrected estimate was still 153% higher than the original baseline.
Wow. So even being cautious, it was still more than double.
Yep. It came out to US $11.8 billion, $12.4 billion, even without those outliers. So whichever way you slice it, the conclusion is the same. The currently recorded costs are a massive underestimate.
And this underestimation isn't spread evenly, is it? You mentioned policymakers flying blind. The model must have highlighted some countries where the blindness was, well, almost total.
Absolutely. The percentage increases in projected costs for some member states were just astronomical, highlighting where reporting is weakest. Get this. Lithuania saw a projected increase of over 1 million%.
Wait, did you say million? 1 million% increase.
1,093,525%, and Malta was up nearly 130,000%.
Those numbers are almost unbelievable. It basically means the previously reported reliable costs were effectively zero for the species modeled.
Pretty much. It pinpoints where the data collection infrastructure is perhaps most lacking. But it's important to note, while those percentage increases are shocking, the biggest raw dollar increases in projected costs fell on larger economies.
Okay, so who saw the biggest jump in actual billions of dollars?
That would be the Czech Republic, followed by Germany, and then France. So the large economies still bear the largest absolute financial burden, even if the percentage jump wasn't as mind-boggling.
Okay, so we see geographical disparities. What about which parts of the economy or society are bearing these newly unveiled costs? Did the model show which sectors had the biggest hidden burden?
Yes, and this was another really insightful finding. When they broke it down by sector, the area projected to have the largest additional costs was public and social welfare.
Public and social welfare. How big was the increase there?
An incredible 950% increase was projected for that sector.
7,000%. What does that even cover?
Yeah, it likely covers things like public health costs. Think allergies from invasive pollen, diseases spread by invasive vectors, damage to public infrastructure, maybe impacts on recreation or cultural services, costs that often fall on, well, the public purse or affect general well-being, but aren't typically logged under agriculture or forestry.
That suggests these more diffuse societal costs are perhaps the most systematically underreported right now.
It certainly seems that way. Following public and social welfare, The next biggest projected increases were in forestry, up around 4,588%, and then costs borne by authorities and stakeholders, up 611%.
And how did this break down between, say, the cost of the actual damage caused by the invader versus the cost of trying to manage or control it?
That was interesting, too. The projection massively increased the estimated management cost by 300 and 933%. The estimated damage costs also went up, but by a smaller, though still substantial, 325%.
A nearly 4,000% increase in management costs. What does that imply?
It suggests there's a vast amount of ongoing unreported effort and expenditure across the EU just trying to deal with these species monitoring control programs, eradication attempts that isn't being captured in the current reliable cost data. There's likely a huge hidden management burden.
Okay, so the current picture, once corrected, is already pretty sobering at $28 billion. What about the future? Did the study project these costs forward?
They did. They used robust statistical methods looking at trends from 1980 up to 2017 to project potential costs out to the year 2040.
And what are we looking at by 2040?
Well, as with any projection, there's a range of uncertainty, but the estimates are quite concerning. The projected total annual cost by 2040 ranged from around US $42 billion up to potentially US $148.2 billion.
Nearly $150 billion per year by 2040.
That's the upper estimate, yes, particularly if current trends, including those high-impact events, continue. It shows a steeply rising trajectory.
What's driving that projected increase so sharply? Is it more damage or more management?
It seems to be significantly driven by the projected increase in management costs. These costs, while only making up about 11% of the reliable observed costs they started with, show the steepest upward curve in the projections.
Which makes sense, right? As more alien species establish and spread, the effort needed just to try and keep them in check has to ramp up.
Exactly. It reflects the growing need for intervention, for spending money on control, containment, maybe eradication if you're lucky. That requires increasing government budgets and resources.
Now, we should be careful with projections, of course. 20 years is a long time. Lots can change. Did the authors highlight specific limitations or caveats we need to keep in mind?
Oh, absolutely. They were very clear about the uncertainties. Projections always require caution. One key point is how a single, very costly species can disproportionately affect the totals.
Like an example they gave.
Yeah, they mentioned common ragweed, Ambrosia artemisifolia. The huge damage costs reported, particularly from Romania and Hungary, were largely driven by this one species due to its health impacts like allergies. So one widespread high-impact invader can really skew the picture.
That makes sense. What else?
Another important limitation they noted was about the efficiency of management spending. Their model projects the amount of spending likely needed, but it couldn't tell if that money is being spent effectively.
Ah, right. So $1 billion spent on a successful eradication program is very different from $1 billion spent on just sort of continually trying to suppress something without success.
Exactly. Is it costly but effective eradication, or is it cheaper but ultimately ineffective long-term mitigation? The model couldn't distinguish that, and from a policy perspective, that distinction is absolutely critical.
Definitely. And they also didn't factor in any potential positive effects of alien species, did they? Although that's often controversial.
Right, they acknowledged that, but stated that any potential positives, maybe carbon sequestration by some invasive plants or niche roles in restoration, are generally very localized and nowhere near the scale of the massive economic costs these species impose overall.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The big takeaway seems undeniable. That $7.3 billion in reliable observed costs we thought we knew is just a fraction of the real story. The true burden is likely closer to $28 billion today and heading towards potentially $150 billion annually within 2 decades.
That's the core message. The hidden economic toll is vast and growing rapidly.
So what does this mean practically for policymakers, for taxpayers across the EU?
Well, the implication is pretty clear. Action needs to be scaled up and urgently. The paper strongly calls for much better, more comprehensive cost reporting across all member states.
And not just from the usual suspects like agriculture ministries.
No, exactly. They emphasize the need for outreach to sectors where these costs are currently hidden, like public health agencies, insurance industries, maybe even infrastructure managers, the sources of those huge public and social welfare costs.
Getting that data transparency is key for making smarter decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it reinforces what we already know from other research. Investing early pays off. Putting money into biosecurity, preventing species from arriving and establishing in the first place, is far, far cheaper in the long run than trying to manage them once they're widespread.
Prevention is better and cheaper than the cure. It ultimately saves taxpayer money down the line.
Definitely. But there's a final thought in the paper that's, well, quite provocative. It connects these rising invasion costs to broader EU stability.
Oh.
They argue that these increasing socioeconomic damages, especially when combined with other pressures like, say, budget cuts for environmental agencies or ongoing economic stress from geopolitical tensions, could actually start to fuel political friction. The sheer cost burden could become a point of contention between member states or between different societal groups.
So the argument is that if these costs keep spiraling upwards without a coordinated, large-scale response, they could actually exacerbate political debates and potentially even weaken the EU's stability or cohesion.
That's the potential risk they highlight. It frames the fight against biological invasions not just as an environmental necessity, but as crucial for maintaining economic health and political stability across the bloc.
It really elevates the stakes, doesn't it? Failing to get a handle on this isn't just bad for nature, it could have real geopolitical consequences down the road.
It's a compelling point. Without fixing the data gaps and seriously ramping up investment in prevention and coordinated management, these costs will just continue to climb, eroding natural capital, undermining climate and sustainability goals, and potentially causing serious economic and political strain.
A really powerful conclusion and a necessary wake-up call based on this research. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive into the hidden costs. We hope this gives you, our listener, a much clearer picture of the true scale of the challenge.